So I guess today what I wanted to talk about was the way that I think games journalism is unironically a huge variable in the rightward shift of men, in young men in particular. So for those of you who haven't been following politics somehow, Donald Trump won the most recent election, and I've been seeing a lot of articles about, like what was the reason for this. And most of the people who I read, who I would describe as like reasonable people, have attributed most of this to kind of like an inflation or immigration shock. And I think that that's basically right. Like, I think any other story about why Trump won that isn't fundamentally based around inflation or immigration is missing most of the picture. But I think that there's a deeper, more consistent trend that isn't just around this like kind of 2022 end of COVID expenditure and kind of like implicit price controls. That is just that young men today don't trust journalism at all. So I'll give some context. My wife, I was looking at her Instagram feed, and I realized that basically all of the news she consumes is through prestige news organizations, right? So it's like they're not on their actual website, but it's like the Washington Post's Instagram feed, it's like the New York Times Instagram feed. And I was contrasting this with myself, and I realized like I don't actually consume very much quote unquote prestige news at all, right? And I was like trying to self-interrogate a little bit why this is. And most of the reason that this is just it doesn't exist very much in the areas that I consume news. So like I'll read The Economist, I'll read the Wall Street Journal, but mostly on like Reddit and YouTube, there's these quote unquote prestige news organizations are not like super heavily factored in. But the absence of these prestige news organizations from like male dominated websites is like an important question, right? Like we should want to know why young men don't consume this kind of news, right? And in particular, I think if you're like a liberal person, like I've seen just a fuck ton of conversations around people being like, oh, we need a liberal Joe Rogan, or we need a liberal Theo Von, right? And the idea right there is that like they're not being able to get their preferred narrative into these settings. And I think for a variety of reasons that many people have talked about, like the idea of like a liberal Joe Rogan is kind of like prima facie insane. But I think that like it's not insane that the New York Times could still have like a large young male readership. So what is it to me? Well, there's like lots of competing stories here, but I think the biggest variable, the largest variable for why young men don't consume prestige news is just that games journalism is dog shit. Okay, I'm going to present my basic hypothesis here, and then I'll kind of like articulate it. People mostly behave as Bayesians, and Bayesians is this complicated idea that is represented by this formula called Bayes' theorem, which kind of says that like you update truth conditionally on how true you think the signal is, right? So like, let me give an example. Someone comes to you who you really trust, and they say, like, hey, by the way, there's a fire that's on the way that's going to like burn down your neighborhood. It's like your parents come to you and say this. You're going to really think that like, look, there's very high credibility that my parents aren't lying to me about a forest fire going to come burn down my neighborhood. But like a homeless guy, like some fented out homeless dude comes up to you and says like, hey, by the way, the whole neighborhood's going to burn down. You really shouldn't integrate that information as much as you would your parents. Like you just don't trust this source. So we all behave like Bayesians all the time, right? Like we're getting signals and we're taking some more credibly, we're taking some less credibly, and it changes the way that we integrate this information. Well, we also update the credibility of an institution based on how accurate they are, right? And these things are done kind of like in groups. So as much as we may want to separate aspects of the news media, people generally clump this stuff, and I think reasonably together, right? So it's like the news media is something that you have some view of credibility, like the government is something you have some view of credibility around, like and then you might have different credibility for different agencies inside the government or different specific newspapers, but these things spill over to each other, right? Like when the CIA lies about something, This changes how credibly you treat the news coming out of the Department of Energy, even if these are like completely different organizations, just because it says something important about the way that they're run. So the same thing exists, obviously, as like I kind of hinted at, inside the news media, right? So it's like when there's a huge news media scandal in one institution, this kind of like spills over the credibility into the other ones. Like you start looking like, oh, like, okay, like newspaper X really lied, and I thought that they weren't a liar. So there's just a higher chance that probably newspaper Y is also lying, right? Like this is just like a rational way for humans to behave. The problem is that games journalists lie constantly. Like, and maybe they don't lie, right? Like in some, like, they don't tell like just false information, but they definitely like gaslight like a huge amount. And there's this very strange adversarial relationship between like prestige games news, like the IGN, GameSpot. I don't even know all the ones that exist, and kind of like the consumers of this news, which is very odd. And this is kind of like a decade-old hangover from Gamergate, right? And for those of you who are young Zoomers or Gen Alphas, Gamergate was this like original culture war bullshit, where what happened was there was this game developer named Zoe who had developed this kind of like quirky depression game, and it had gotten, my understanding was, relatively good reviews, but the general, like, quote unquote, like, you can think of them as like the Joker gamer crowd, like, was not a fan of it. And she was accused on a blog post by her ex-boyfriend of having slept with games journalists to try to like gain credibility, or no, credibility is the wrong word, like to get better reviews, right? And so then, of course, like, young men did what young men do, and they just like completely went crazy and started like sending rape threats and death threats to her, and it got picked up in this whole like toxicity in gamer culture, right? And like their perspective, and by theirs I mean Zoe's, Anita Sarkeesian and Brianna Wu, who ironically now is like vaguely conservative. He has been well represented and documented by the mainstream press. Well, the gamer's perspective was basically that there was this like hostile takeover that was happening to their fandom, right? Like that you had these outsiders who were uninterested in the culture that existed, and they wanted to come in and they wanted to change it to be like more inclusive. And obviously this happened, right? Like I don't think that anyone can really dispute that games as an industry now is just like much less toxic and much less male dominated than it was a decade ago, right? And I think most people, and I'm almost like legally required to say this, would view this as like a vaguely pretty good thing, right? Like at least like a neutral thing. But it has like important effects on the way that these groups interact with each other, and as the group of like underrepresented people has grown and become more significant, games journalists have kind of had mission creep to just be their perpetual defenders, right? So it's like now whenever there's a game that kind of like points at like social or cultural issues, games journalists make it their job to defend that game against toxic gamers. And this is just, in my mind, like a pure outgrowth of just like a culture of combativeness between games journalists and gamers. The problem is that they just lie as a result to kind of win these arguments. So, I mean, like, I know I've not played the game, but I know everyone's been like following like the Veilguard nonsense, and you I have no idea if that game is good or not. Like, it doesn't look like the kind of game that I would enjoy, and I've seen enough very cringy clips from it that it's not worth my time to try to like take it. I'm a busy person. But like, you also probably played like Space Marine 2, right? Like, this was a really good game, like a really fun game, and it got like kind of mediocre reviews from these prestige newspapers and games journalist website, and you can't really wrap your head around how a game that everyone would agree is bad, like Concord, for example, could get like really good reviews, but a game that pretty much everyone agrees is amazing, like Space Marine 2, would like struggle to get the reviews that people would think it would deserve without some context of just like the games journalists come at this review with an explicit agenda, which is to teach gamers that like they shouldn't be toxic, right? And to like act as like a combative force against them. So there's this like good IGN article that I'll just like link on the screen that like basically explicitly outlines this, right? Like the writer basically points out like, look, if IGN didn't exist, right? Like, or websites like IGN, I believe it's IGN, then all that would be left is like the toxic gamers. Like, who would speak for the marginalized people without these newspapers? And this is just the way that gamers perceive games media, right? Like, they don't perceive it as like an honest representative of the truth. Instead, they perceive it as like an activist organization for specific social causes. And then if you add to this, right, like there's this additional variable, which is just that gamers and kind of like the whole culture around gamers is actually like extremely important to a lot of people. That most people's first exposure, and I know at least for me, to kind of like online life, like life on the internet, was through like gaming communities, right? So like I used to watch this like YouTuber called like Aroomba07 who plays Paradox games. I have no idea if he still makes videos, and like that felt like a little bit of a community, right? And that like you feel like these. You feel like tribal defensiveness for these gamers. And it's like really not fun. It's really not fun to have someone come in and say that the shit you enjoy is bad, right? And simultaneously, you have all these YouTubers who are constantly in an adversarial relationship with the news media, and they say basically things that you agree with all the time, right? So if like you watch like Asmongold, for example, like he's going to be saying things that like most 90% of gamers are going to think is true. Like he's going to be saying this game is good, this game is bad. You know, he's going to be saying like microtransactions are bad, and that the constant reminder that games journalists aren't there to tell the truth. They're there to win culture war battles. Really inoculates all young men that this is just the purpose of media. That like, what is the purpose of media? The purpose of media is to like act as a counterbalancing force against popular desires that they perceive as like overly toxic, right? And so you just grow up in this environment that it's like, if you see a newspaper article, it's a lie. And if you see a YouTube video, it's the truth. And then suddenly you turn 18 and you're just supposed to think like the Washington Post is telling you the truth, but like Hassan is lying to you. Like, well, your entire experience is that the newspapers are liars and the YouTubers are telling the truth. You're a completely rational Bayesian. You just take this information with you and you integrate it into your optimization functions and you just stop listening to newspapers. And so, like, if media wants to win men over, like, they unironically need to improve games journalism. Like, IGN is producing these huge negative externalities on social trust just by lying about shit. And that, like, if they were just willing to say, like, yeah, like, Veilguard, not very good. Like, maybe a little bit too gay. That like, people would then, when they saw the New York Times say Trump is a fascist, believe it. But that when IGN is unwilling or unable to admit that, like, look, Concord is worse than Space Marine 2, then the problem is that then when newspapers in general come out and say something, people just don't believe them. Like, it's just literally as simple as that. Like, they literally just don't believe them. Anyway, that was it.